Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm Harshit Kukreja. Today as my guest, I have my colleague Priyal. Hello Priyal, how are you?
I'm doing good, Harshit. Thank you for having me here today. How have you been?
All good, all good. So today we had a discussion last week, Priyal and I, and we were trying to read about, and we are now trying to, we have developed as one of our focus areas of using learnings from biology into policy. We are trying to develop that. So for that, we were doing some reading, and there's a very interesting book that we like charged upon. It's called Why Humans Cooperate. So today we'll have a discussion around what we found interesting in this book, and basically one part of this very interesting book.
Yeah, but I think Harshit, before we begin, there's something that I would like to say before we start, right? As our listeners might know about the Takshashila Institution, but just to give a formal introduction, the Takshashila Institution is an independent, a non-partisan think tank. And we also are a school of public policy, and we have education programs that sort of are catered to people who want to get some basic information about policy and how things work around. And there are courses that are tailored specifically for people who are interested into diving into the public policy side of things. And they're all online and you can take them from anywhere. So currently we have admissions that are open for our 12-week graduate certificate program in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, and technology and policy. And the cohort starts in September 2022, and the applications are now open. So if you want more information about this course and how to apply and for the applications, please do visit school.takshashila.org.in/GCPP to find out more. And also you can log into takshashila.org.in for all our research and all our commentaries, etc. Especially essentially what we do in this organization.
Thanks, Priyal, for such a nice plugin.
Right. So yeah, I think like essentially like what Harshit spoke about, we were discussing about this particular book and we kind of wanted to see if there are any concepts of biology that we can sort of apply in the field of public policy and see if we can get any insights from biology when it comes to solving public policy problems, right? And that's where we discovered this book, which both Harshit and I found a little interesting. So we thought, let's read it. Let's see if we can get any beginner's idea about how to apply certain concepts and stuff. So that's where I think the initial idea for this podcast even generated.
Yeah. So the book, I think a lot of people would be familiar with this concept called dual inheritance theory.
Right. But I think if we were to sort of like, if I were to define dual inheritance theory for people who aren't too aware of it, is that it is basically a theoretical framework that sort of says that human biology and human behavior, they are influenced by two lines of inherited information. Okay. So one is the genetic line and the other one is the cultural line. So in genetic line, is that all the characters and everything are inherited from their biological parents. And when it comes to the cultural line, it says that it is basically unique to our species and we inherit it from the other members of our society. All right. And so basically, to sum it all up, it takes into account that of the evolution of our capacities for that is culture, which is sophisticated social learning, and the cultural evolution in itself, and sort of that interaction or sort of the co-evolution of culture and genes over thousands of years.
So yeah. So I think if we like explain it with an example, it would be much better. I have a very good example, but do tell me if it like tends to end in a circle and it gets too circular. So yeah. So for instance, there are a group of hunter gatherers
Hmm.
who live together.
Right.
And what happens is because of a genetic evolution, a mutation ends up,
Mutation, yeah.
a mutation ends up being in one person of the group, which makes him more likely to cooperate with other people.
Right.
And slowly, because he's now, and he forms sort of like a different group. He forms a different subsection of people who are more likely to cooperate with each other because they share the same gene.
Right.
And because they're hunter gatherers and they are now living in groups, so people who cooperate with one another have a evolutionary advantage.
Hmm.
And because cooperating, people can now see, the hunter gatherers can now see that if you cooperate, you get better sort of like game, you get better resources, you get better food. You are also
Right.
protected against animals and elements and everything else. So there is also a short-term advantage which they can see. There's a survival advantage. So
Yeah.
now for cooperating, there's also cultural pressure that if you'll cooperate, if everybody cooperates with one another, and it is now expected that people will cooperate. So the people who tend to cooperate more are more likely to survive in that group, are more likely to be accepted in that group.
Right.
So what happens is because of cultural pressure, the cooperation gene is pushed more because the people who tend to cooperate more
Hmm.
have better chances of surviving in that group and being a part of that group.
Right.
And because the gene is now pushed, this trait is now pushed more. And because this trait is now pushed more, so a majority of people in the group now have that mutation.
Hmm.
And because a majority of people have that mutation which makes cooperate more, so there's also genetic pressure to cooperate more.
Right.
So cultural is sort of influencing genetic traits passing into offsprings, and genetic traits are now influencing culture.
Mm.
So both of them influence one another. It's sort of like a gene culture co-evolution thing.
Right.
So
Yeah,
I
and
hope,
that's, I think, what dual inheritance theory is all about, right? It is all about the co-evolution of genes and culture and how both of them sort of influence each other. It's like a loop where both of them influence each other to form that particular looping in place.
yeah, so it's very interesting to read, and it's sometimes, at least for the first time when I read it, I think a few years back, I was a little confused because I thought I understand that genetics will obviously influence your culture and influence your
Right.
behavior, but I thought the timelines were very different because genes, if you look at a genetic timeline, it it is like generational. It's
Hmm.
like a generational thing, and cultural would operate on a much smaller timeline. So
Right.
I had a difficult time wrapping my head around how the timelines intersected and how would they influence. But now I hope I am like much clearer and I'm able to convey this information in a much clearer way.
Right. But I think you explained it fairly well because, I mean, essentially, I think when you first read it initially, it becomes a little difficult to wrap your head around it because I think so much of our whatever educational studies and everything, at least when it comes to biology and stuff, core biology, we focus mainly on the only on the genetic side of it, right? We don't really study culture alongside, and we don't really know how they sort of influence each other. But I think after I started reading this book was when I sort of taking when I sort of understood how it is sort of interlinked, and I'm sort of reading more about in what way and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's like quite fun. I think there's no intersection of social sciences with biology
Yeah,
education in our country.
right. Fair enough.
Even though it's very interesting and it has like very real world applications,
Yeah,
but there's no inter like I've nowhere, even in elite institutes, I've never seen this intersection except for a very few minority, like a very small minor percentage of people who are working like researching in this field. Except them I've like seen no one. So when we are talking about culture, a few interesting things which I like came across. So culture is when you like culture and learning is when you like learn from other people and then you pick up habits, and that is when you become part of, then you learn the culture of that
right,
place
right.
or
Yeah,
your parents or your caste or your family or whatever group you adhere to
hmm.
and whatever your
Right.
religion, whatever. you adhere to. So, but there's one major issue with learning, at
Hmm.
least learning like this, that information is very costly.
Yeah.
So there are always trade-offs between acquiring sort of like accurate behavioral information
Hmm.
and time and resources.
Right.
So
Also, I think it means that basically what it says is that when you have like these behavioral information, if it is, so you have to, there are two ways, right? There is, you acquire like accurate behavioral information at a very high cost, or like less accurate information at a very low cost. That kind of a thing.
yeah, it's a trade-off. You have to optimize your resources and you'll have to see that how like beneficial is it for you to get maybe like 30-40% more accurate information at 2x or 3x the time and resources cost. It's very interesting that how we have learned to optimize these things. For instance, I did not like write for articles and everything else. I mean research articles.
Mhm.
But when I started writing research articles, there were two ways of learning how to write research articles. So either it's you write and you learn from your colleagues and your professors and your
Yeah, yeah.
everything else. The other way is you take a course,
A
full,
writing course, basically.
yeah, a full 3 months, 6 months course. But that is a very costly thing to do. That is acquiring accurate information at a very high cost, and compare that to learning from colleagues and learning while you are writing. That is a sort of like
Yeah.
acquiring information at low cost. So it's
Right, right.
always a trade-off.
Yeah.
So yeah. And the book also mentions biases.
Yeah, yeah. I think it talks about, I think basically like because we were talking about culture learning, right? And how we acquire that learning in our lives. Like you mentioned about like most of the cultural learning that we have is because we've observed it in within our parents and sort of within our society, our community, the caste and all of that. And what this book talks about is also that it says that the culture learning, the mechanisms of culture learning can be categorized into like two parts. One is like you have certain biases, and these biases can be of two types. One is like a content bias, and the other is like a context bias. And so, content bias is basically a direct bias. And I remember, I think Harshit, you only mentioned this example early on when we had sort of very primitively when we were discussing this book was like, if for example there is a farmer who sort of breaks coconuts when he's his plantation time. But then people sort of, and if his son is doing really well at studies and everything, people assume that breaking coconut means that they associate breaking coconut to every good thing that happens, right? Whereas for context biases, which are like indirect biases, there is even under context biases, you take into picture the context of that particular tradition or that particular culture that you've learned. And then, but under context biases, also there are two different types. There is like the success and the prestige bias, as well as like the conformity bias. So, Harshit, if you have like better
Yeah.
examples, you're
So
more welcome to
like
it.
explaining a little bit on that example. So breaking coconuts, when you like break coconuts, maybe the farmer break coconuts when he starts his farm work, and then he sees that, oh, so if I'm breaking coconuts, I'm able to get good, like good plants. I'm able to
Yield,
get
good
good
yield,
yield. Yeah.
basically. Yeah.
And then what he does is he also breaks coconuts when he wants his child to be like very successful in school. So he takes the content from one successful venture
Yeah.
and copy
And
paste,
applies it for everything.
like
Yeah.
copies and paste it in a different field. Yeah,
Yeah.
so there is that. So this is what you observe a lot. So when you like start thinking about these biases and then you break situations and then you'll see that these hold quite true even in different situations we deal with, and even in when we try to learn things from people and everything else.
Hmm.
Coming back to context biases are basically indirect biases.
Yeah.
So it's a very crude sort of like categorization, but the book categorize context biases into two. One is success and prestige bias, the other is conformity bias.
Right.
So I'll start with a quick introduction. success and prestige bias. So, what people tend to do is they tend to selectively learn from people who they think are successful,
Hmm.
even though not in their field. They people tend to associate certain things as success and then follow whatever those people are doing. Obviously, people take into account if they're similar to these people or
Right.
if they are different and what they've done. But this is sort of like trying a way around the costly information hypothesis
Hmm.
that you don't want to spend a lot of time and energy figuring everything out from scratch. So you look at people who you think are successful. For instance, in our society, you'll see that having a good house, having a car, having a lot of money is tied to success.
Hmm.
So when you see maybe somebody in your field who is like, who has a big house, uh, drives a large car, or very like Audi, I don't know, Audi or something, and has a lot of money. So you associate that with success and you say that, oh, so if I do what he has done, or if I do what she has done, then my chances of being successful is more.
Right.
So you try to replicate whatever sort of like he or she has done. So one more example, this, I think this podcast is filled with us trying to explain things with examples.
Yeah, I think one of the striking example that I could find was, I think, especially with the prestige and success bias, was that, for example, if you have like a PhD person, entering a department and sort of aiming to get a tenure, right? She wants a tenure at the day. So she will choose whom to sort of, she will assess whose steps to follow, right? And she can do it in multiple different ways. So for first thing, if she has to assess a person's, if she wants to assess a person's prestige, then she can do it by either like listening or observing how people sort of like act towards one another. And if she's like really, really serious about it, she might actually pull out people's CV, or like she can see how many number of publications these people have. And this could give her a fair idea of, success in that way. Now, even after that, if she still wants to go a step further, she might actually read everybody's papers and and sort of see watch how they teach the students and everything. So this will now give her a measure of skill of a certain type. So now she's found like different ways of assessing people based on like their prestige, their success, as well as their skill. And then overall, she can then determine who fits into her category of like, out of these three things, now that she's fairly assessed everybody, whose work that she needs to closely follow to sort of reach that level herself. So that kind of gives you a fair idea about how people sort of, go after, observe people very closely and have their own subjective, what do you say, method of analyzing these sort of bias, have these biases in them.
Yeah, I think that was wonderfully explained. That PhD example.
Right.
Really fun. So before we proceed, let us take a short break and we'll come back.
Yeah, sure.
Hello, listeners. Welcome back to All Things Policy. In this episode, we were talking about biases, biology, and policy, and trying to use biological insights. So, Priyal, welcome back. So,
Yeah,
you were,
hi.
so I think we'll continue after your PhD example. So, you were saying about success and prestige biases.
Right. Yeah. So I think when I was talking about like the PhD example also, and when you generally talk about, I think, the success and prestige bias cultural learning, you kind of observe few things, right? One is that these sort of like these imitative patterns that you see when I gave you the PhD example also, I told you how that person, that PhD student can sort of assess what whose behavior or whose pattern that she needs to follow and something. These kind of they spontaneously sort of these imitative patterns, they sort of spontaneously appear at incentivized circumstances. obviously that there is some sort of monetary benefit or any other kind of returns, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be this thing. And also in non-incentivized circumstances. Also, surprisingly, it's also there in both non-social situations or even the social situations where there could be potential competition between the learners. Also, and another thing that I also noticed was that these kind of effects that are there, they come in broad context. This context could be in terms of like your economic decisions that you might take, or even on your opinions, your personal opinions, or your ideologies, or even like in your preferences when it comes to food, whether it is some of your personal beliefs or even stories, etc. And even they can play a role in like they could come to play in some sort of like in terms of even conflict situations. Another thing is also that this kind of cultural learning that we observe is sort of it very much critically depends on the degree of uncertainty which is found in the environment. For example, you gave the farmers example, right? Where so this is farming is fairly a very uncertain environment in itself because there's so much of variability that is found, right? Because no, so at that point, these sort of biases play a significant role because you assume that, oh, if this person did this particular thing and he got such a high yield, so I am also going to do the same thing, hoping that I'm also going to get the same yield. You're not going to sit and analyze as to why that particular thing worked for this guy to give such a significant amount of yield, kind of thing. And these sort of learning patterns also emerge when there is the based when the model's domain of competence, success, or even prestige is sort of unrelated to the domain and sort of question. So these are some of the learnings that I personally found when I was sort of reading about these biases.
Yeah, so about the last point you said,
Mhm.
that even if, for instance, one person does not have expertise or is not like successful in one field, but is super successful in another,
Right.
so people tend to follow whatever it says in this field. So, for instance, Amitabh Bachchan says that, oh, so Chyawanprash is very good for your health and it will make your immunity stronger.
Yeah,
People tend to
believe
follow
that.
that, yeah, believe that.
Yeah, even like for example, like Shah Rukh Khan saying that, listen, I put Head and Shoulders in my hair so I don't get dandruff. So
Yeah,
people, he's not a dermatologist of any kind, but he's successful in his acting career. So people just believe ki, oh yeah, if Shah Rukh Khan puts this and doesn't get dandruff in his head, so if I put it also, I'm also not gonna get.
yeah,
There's
even
no.
though, but somewhere you know that he does not have expertise in this, but
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
a
yeah. You
bias.
know that he doesn't. Somewhere you know that he doesn't. But even then, your belief, you tend to sort of want to follow what he's doing simply because his degree of success is so huge that even if it's a small part of it is something that gives you some kind of advantage, you're going to believe that, right?
Yeah, even though you know it's an ad, he's getting
Yeah,
paid
yeah.
for it. Yeah, that is the thing, and that is, I think, when we understand all these biases and when we understand that how people sort of like try to learn from each other and try to, and how people can be influenced, and so the policy implementation and policy formation would be much better.
Right, right. Yeah.
So the second type of context biases,
Hmm.
a conformity bias. So conformity bias is when you try to conform to whatever the standards are there in the sort of like in the room. You
Hmm.
can whatever the standards are in the society or in whatever group we adhere to, or whatever at that time whatever group we are looking at. And in that also the book broadly classifies the biases into informational conformity
Right.
and normative conformity. So
Hmm.
information conformity is when you see people doing something and you
Right.
believe that because a lot of people are doing this, this will help. You sort of like actually believe that, and you change your internal opinions and beliefs. Compared it to normative. Normative conformity is you only conform because you don't want to appear like deviant. So I'll give
Right.
you an example. A lot of offices have a practice of getting MacBooks,
Hmm.
Apple
Yeah.
products. So when the new person comes, he says that out of the 20 people working there, 15 have MacBooks.
MacBooks.
And he talks to people but he previously used a Windows laptop. So he talks to people and now he is convinced that, oh, so MacBooks are better for whatever work we do at the office. And I should get a MacBook. And he gets a MacBook. The other sort of like the normative conformities, when you see that, oh, so everybody has a MacBook,
Hmm.
and now you want to have a MacBook because you don't want to appear like a deviant.
Right. You don't want
Well,
to appear too
internal,
different from the group,
yeah,
right? So you will
maybe
have to get
because
a MacBook.
there are certain repercussions to that. Maybe they're like maybe they're like practical problems because books they all link up with each other like very well. Or maybe people don't like. Maybe his boss doesn't like when he gets a Windows laptop.
Right.
His boss prefers a MacBook, and everybody prefers a MacBook. So he doesn't want to appear like a deviant, a rebel. So
Hmm.
this is normative conformity. So now your internal beliefs are not changed,
Hmm.
but you want to,
Still conform to the group, right? So you're going to stick to that.
yeah. So it's like it's a bias. So you
Yeah.
try to like not be deviant. You don't want to be the odd one out.
Right.
You change your superficial behavior, but your opinions and beliefs, your internal beliefs remain same. You still believe that a Windows laptop is better than a
Hmm.
MacBook, but because everybody has that and you don't want to like upset people, upset people, so you get a MacBook.
Right.
So it's a sort of like a conformity bias.
Right.
Yeah, I can say it's a very interesting read when you see that how people tend to pick up cues and how people like see other people and how people see information and how people see knowledge and how people see how society and as a whole and how people measure success
Hmm.
and how you can try to use that to your advantage when you are designing policies and when you are trying to make an existing policy better. For instance, if you want people, for instance, what the health ministry did was they roped in Amitabh Bachchan for the Pulse Polio campaign.
Yeah.
And it was the face of that campaign. And a lot of people, because Amitabh Bachchan, the message was coming through Amitabh Bachchan,
Hmm.
you have to keep that in mind that he has no expertise in
Yeah.
vaccination or health. He's not from a biology background or a health background or a public health background. He's not remotely related to all these things. He's a famous superstar. He's a film
Right.
star. If he says maybe something about making movies or acting or anything else, that is what I think is like all right because
Yeah.
uh,
I think that I think extension also happened during COVID, right? When the government wanted to motivate or get people to wear more masks and stay at home and everything. During the first phase of the pandemic, there was this one video that was circulating around of Amitabh Bachchan and a lot of big names of South superstars. And all of these sort of, which they were looking for, I think, specs or spectacles or something. So they roped in a lot of film stars that a huge demographic of people could relate to because they're superstars, right, of their region or their state or something. And they got them. There was some sort of like a way to sort of get people to understand that staying at home is important during COVID and stuff like that. So that bias thing has been applied. I don't know if it was intentional or not, but it has been applied.
yeah, so you know that even if you like cannot put that in like technical words and biases and
Yeah, yeah.
categorize them. So you know that, but it is like when you read it, it becomes obvious. So this is normal. This is
Yeah. I
much
mean, you don't
obvious.
consciously think of it when you're doing it, but when you read about these things, and then when you sort of try to look for examples, these kind of examples finally suddenly start making sense. You're like, oh, wait, yeah, this actually is an example for this particular bias. And we do apply this a lot in our real life. But we don't know that this is a bias in the first place, right? Because, we were, at least I wasn't aware of it until I read the book.
Yeah, I don't think I had thought about it a lot before reading this particular source. So one more example is there's a scientist called as Fauci. So he was leading the sort of regular updates in US about COVID, regular updates, and he was sort of the face of the COVID effort. And I think in our discussion we discussed this, but what I thought at that time was because he has a very good scientific standing, he has been fighting infectious disease, I think, since the time of AIDS, the AIDS pandemic. He was part of something. He has that expertise, he has that standing, he knows the technical knowledge, he can answer questions. And but if you would have put, I don't know, maybe Beyonce or maybe some superstar, how successful would have been? Would have been too successful? Or would the messaging been better? Or yeah, so I think after reading this and after analyzing and after the few papers I went through, I think you have to pick your message and see that how does that work and how do you target? Because you can also not dilute your message by giving that person 10 things.
Yeah,
You
fair
cannot
enough.
make Amitabh Bachchan talk about polio,
Multiple
typhoid,
things, right? You can't make
diarrhea.
him talk
Yeah.
about polio, tuberculosis, vaccination, COVID-19, all of that. That sort of doesn't dilute the message because one person is sort of the face of multiple campaigns.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thanks, Priyal. That was
Yeah,
a
thanks,
very
Harshit. Thanks
fun
for
discussion.
inviting me and for having this conversation with me. This was quite fun.
Yeah. So
Bye-bye.
bye bye.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.